Samir, a warm welcome. And I must say that when I started reading about your profile and then I went to Dr. Mehta's hospital, I was blown away because I frankly was not aware about so many decades. And you will be celebrating 90 years now of contribution that you have, not being from Chennai, probably has been one of the reasons. So very keen to know before I come to you as a person, and of course, by way of introduction, Samir Mehta is vice chairman of Dr. Mehta's hospital. That is only a part of his introduction, maybe even a small part. He does play a role in many other areas, which we'll hope to discover in this conversation. Tell us a little bit about Dr. Mehta's hospital itself. And what happened? Did somebody from way back, your grandfather's generation, come from Gujarat to start this in Chennai, or what is the story all about?
So thank you, Prasanjit, and I'd like to also thank the team at the Great Managers Institute. I think what you guys do is a fantastic job and make lives a little bit more inspirational for others and hopefully individuals as well. Look, the story of Dr. Mehta is, you could spend a fair bit of time, but succinctly, it was started 90 years ago by my grandparents, both my grandfather and grandmother. I think this was during the era of the British Empire where there were friends of the British and then everybody else. And everybody else, just like in most parts of India, today still in rural India, are a larger percentage of the population. And in those days, having two doctors who came from Gujarat originally and who'd settled in Chennai, they were invited to basically settle by the Samaj at that time, because there were no representative doctors for North Indians in South India, and especially in the capital of the British Empire at the time from an Indian context. It was very interesting times, and I have only heard a few of the stories of times there, but let me first be very clear. We stand on the shoulders of giants, not just my grandparents, but also the many clinicians, nurses, allied health technicians and administrators that have played a key part of the role, all the way to the consumers who make life that little bit smilier because they come and thank you for either soft landings of their next generation, or sometimes the transition of their silver generations to the next level of eternity. And I think we play a role in all of those things. And Dr. Mehta's has grown systematically. I think we've been fortunate in that we haven't had third-party forces other than perhaps regulatory in compliance or consumer behavior to push us to do things that perhaps we aren't ready to do as well. And so it's a combination of these factors. We started off with 2 beds. Today, we represent 500 beds across 2 hospitals. It took us a long time, 88 years before we could give birth. And the irony is, over this time, we've helped give birth to over 1 million babies. So a percentage of Tamil Nadu and what I would call 1 million in a billion in India. We played a role in, I think, a lot of customers across their generations. So we've got these 403 people who are 3 generations born with us. So they've had their grandparents themselves and sometimes their grandkids. And now we have 4 of these folks who have had the 4th generation born with us. And that's a privilege, right? Because at the end of the day, the choice of doing that across time and across generations has not been easy. So I would say that a lot of the special things that Dr. Mehta has focused on and what makes us who we are is because customers have given us a high degree of trust earned across these generations of giants, these generations of consumers who obviously had faith in us and trust in us and have touched us for different reasons, whether it's birthing, whether it's some sort of pediatric intervention, whether it's a surgery in the middle ecosystem, women's health, all the way to geriatric. We have these 7 customers who we call are really special because they're centennials. And these we track very carefully because it is a privilege to share time with people who trust you across a long lease of life, right?
Wow.
Healthcare to a large extent is event based. Uh, but when you have this trust, not only across a lifetime, but then across generations, it means that you started building bonds that are a little bit different because that translates to people trusting you not just for specific services and products, but perhaps with one of the principal focus areas of their life, their health
I
and
think,
quality of life.
at a later stage in this interview, it will be so interesting to understand from you the shifts that has happened from a time when the physician is almost like a part of the family. Sometimes he's almost like God, and to the today's day of analytics and data science, and how that is being used to track customer and customer outcomes. And I hate to use the word customer because that is probably one of the most inspiring sites for me was I was in the Heidelberg University Hospital in Germany just last month. As I entered the surgery floor, the first picture I got was a saying with the gentleman's face, whoever has said that. And the saying is something which we all know: a patient is the most important person in our hospital. And Mohandas Karamchand's saying, which sometimes is around the customer, in this case, they have replaced the word customer with the patient. And it is fascinating to know how the medical sort of industry or the hospital as a concept has shifted over the years. But just before that, let me also know about your story. Both your grandparents, A.J. Mehta and Savita Ben Mehta, were doctors. Your grandfather was a well-known surgeon, and were your parents also doctors? And are you also a physician? What is your story, Samir?
So, Prasenjit, thankfully, I'm not a doctor, perhaps because it gives you a different context on how to be part of this ecosystem and privileged way of life. My parents are also not doctors. They were given I guess, the opportunity to explore different things. And just like that, between my parents and grandparents, predominantly because I didn't like the sight of blood, I'll be very transparent. I saw my first surgery at the age of 10. And honestly, when you see such things, we're squeamish around needles, but whether you like the sight of blood or not is typically a more visceral reaction. And that was something that my parents and my grandparents realized, and they gave us the chance to choose what we did. There was, of course, a little bit of family push here and there saying that you can overcome it and the likes, but I think one of the things that I realized as we were developing, and I was a little bit fortunate, I did part of my high school in India, and then I moved to the United Kingdom at the age of 12. Uh, Partly because I think in those days, our parents were worried about whether we'd get into good schools, including medical school in the early days. So when we moved, we got to see that if you build on your strengths, you typically do better. And I think one of the things that I was very keen on is, I loved business because I liked observing how my grandparents did business, how my parents did business in different industries in the food and pharmaceutical ecosystems. Uh, but they said, go and create something yourself. And that was a lot more inspirational for me. So I went and decided that I loved seeing things built. So I naturally gravitate towards being more of an engineer. And I had a fantastic chemistry professor that kind of like said, you can go and build products or components that might change many, many millions of people's lives. And that was go do it in a chemical plant. So I decided that in the early part of my life, I'd go and try and be a chemical engineer. So that was the start. I'm not a doctor. I think by having the engineering background, it helps give perspective highly analytical in its nature. I think a lot of good people are chemical engineers, whether it's Mukesh Ambani, who are people like that of great inspiration, to the premier of China. So it's a very diverse field. A lot of good people come from a background of engineering as well as chemical engineering, but also I think the problem solving nature, because you have this analytical component with problem solving. Those things have helped a lot in, I guess, shaping the career as it is today.
And it's been quite a transition from chemical engineering. You did your master's in manufacturing engineering management, your MBA in Kellogg, and you have achieved so much academically. And when did you realize that uh, it is important to focus on chemistry between human beings and not just chemical engineering? And when was that shift for you? Because you are one of the 100 best people managers in this country. And needless to say, some things must have influenced you to focus more on people and nurturing and developing people. Was there any one incident, or it was a gradual shift?
I think that's a relatively tough question. I mean, I can say that sometimes the serendipity of the universe puts you where you are at the right time in the right place. And that's probably fair. I mean, I obviously worked in chemical engineering for a number of years. I worked for a number of large multinational companies to go and learn the basics of the trade. So I worked in Exxon, in ICI, BP, and then Shell. Across the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Argentina, and Brazil. And I think I was fortunate because I got to see different components, but also live some of my dreams. I always wanted to build a chemical plant, and I got to do that. I wanted to work on drilling rigs in the middle of nowhere, and I got to do that. So getting the opportunity to learn not just about your fundamentals of engineering at the time, and also people skills, because any of these things that you do, and I think I'll give you one specific incident in my early days in Shell. When you're sitting on a drilling rig and you're one of the senior people, there are lives of 80 people to a large extent that you directly influence and have a key role in. And I was fortunate to be the company representative from Shell with these 70 plus contractors on the rig from very different companies, from the Schlumbergers to the Halliburtons of this world to some of the smaller ones that we don't hear of too much today. But you're in the middle of nowhere. And to a large extent, there is a high amount of focus around making sure you do things fast, because the cost of a drilling rig per day just to rent is about $100,000.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, other resources make this a very expensive operation. And the idea is you go to this specific area, pre-planned, and you drill. In these days, it was gas wells in the middle of the Dutch North Sea, and try and figure out whether you get gas, and that pays for this spend of $20 to $30 million to drill the well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a high amount of push to do things quickly. But what I learned early in my life is you have to earn stripes at basics. So one of the things that, whether you've had a lot of degrees, and I've been very fortunate to study in some of the great institutions around and make the best of some of these opportunities, every day you start with nothing again, right? And if you go with that attitude, and I think that was taught to me by my grandparents and my parents, that if you start every day with DMA, it doesn't mean anything, rather than all the letters that you have behind your name, I think you'll do much better, because that means that you will interact and try and earn respect the real way, which is typically by rolling up our sleeves and sharing the trenches with some of these team members, and don't show that you have perhaps stripes on your shoulders or titles, because at the end of the day, everyone's got a role to play. And if you can share the respect of what they do, as well as perhaps roll up your sleeves and show that you can do the things at the grassroots. So whether it's, I mean, in a hospital, it's things like housekeeping or helping floor, just picking up trash, right? I think simple little things like that. those were learned from the drilling rig days where we had to do things quickly, but we also had to have this much more complex life. You had to drive the ship fast. And on top of that, you had to do it extremely safe. So there were times where I also had to say, guys, let's stop. Let's stop all our operations because where we're going is also highly at risk. And I think if I look back at that experience, a number of those learnings from there play out today. Today, for example, in our hospital at Dr. Mehta's, if we see in intensive care settings, infection risk increasing. So we do swabs every day in a lot of our areas to make sure that infection risk is low and we don't have any hospital-acquired infections, which are always present in hospital environments that perhaps transmute across multiple consumers. And if you get that right, because that's one of the single biggest risk factors or killers in hospitals. Everyone thinks that most killers in hospitals are what a patient comes in with. Actually, one of the biggest key risks are what are the other things you might get. So if you have these simple checksums in your head that, look, you do this systems approach of swabbing every area, especially the critical areas where people are most vulnerable. Number one. Number two, you then allow your team to take decisions to shut down that unit. And keep in mind, when you shut down an intensive care unit or an operating theater, the cost to your institution or system is very high, right? Because you're effectively signaling to your consumers that something is not perfect, right? And people want peace of mind in a hospital setting. So when you want peace of mind, when you take these decisions like this, there is a significant internal cost. Of course, there is an external cost if it is realized, but when you have this simple discipline, we shut down our intensive care unit. We have one of the biggest neonatal intensive care units for typically underweight preterm babies that are born. Right. And when a nurse or a caretaker or a technician can take that decision, it means that we're building trust across each other within the team. And that translates to us with when the technician takes the call that let's shut the unit down because I think the swab is showing that we've got one or two serious potential infections that are there in a hospital. It means that the translated outcome that a customer sees is you have superior controls because you have fewer risks that are actually shown to the customer because they're actually protected. We put barriers in between, we then swab the area, we put them under quarantine and control. Right. And I think that helps. So I think I would say that I learned from my early days. I think rolling up sleeves and spending time in the trenches is something we do. We insist that most of our leaders spend some time in the night shift, some time doing one or two different roles so that we can appreciate what each other does. Because at the end of the day, look, we're all human. And if you can understand a customer's point of view, and the same applies, if you can understand each other's point of view, life is much simpler, right? Yeah. So I think those are the type of learnings we've been able to fortunately pick up from our forefathers, as well as professionals who've shown us how to do things differently in another industry or in the same industry.
In fact, maybe I don't know whether you have realized or not, you have already given us 3 or 4 mantras, which is validated by our research across many people managers. You started by saying that how you are privileged to be on the shoulders of giants. And this is the first thing that we observe amongst great leaders is that they consider leadership as a privilege, as an opportunity, as opposed to, just a way of exercising power. You talked about building on strengths and how your entire UK education was not about forcing you to become another surgeon or a doctor or figuring out what are your strengths that you want to explore. And that's the philosophy that we see in great people managers. You talked about role modeling, and right from your first job, I'm reminded again of Heidelberg University. I had gone because there was one of the most complex possible operation where not just an entire pancreas had to be removed, but obviously when you do that, there are many other parts which have to be also removed or restructured. And it was hugely complicated. And the person who was guiding me in India is the deputy director of Tata Memorial, a renowned oncosurgeon himself. And he said, I went all the way to Heidelberg University to learn from uh, Professor uh, Wolfgang Buchler, Professor Marcus Wolfgang Buchler. He is one of the foremost
Very famous.
surgeons in this field. Now, this is something that people often miss out, that you can't be a people manager by just talking about what you learn in your MBA class. And you have to really go to the trenches. Even if you don't know the job, you must understand the experience of the people in who are undergoing that. And you mentioned about empowerment and how a even a nurse or a technician can actually close down a particular unit. And many people don't know that one of the biggest reasons for mortality in hospitals is secondary infection. And Tell me a little bit more now about the people management journey in a hospital. And let me, as a layman, tell you what I would expect. I would expect that there will be some prima donnas. These are the super specialists who have a larger than life kind of image. I would expect that there will be a lot of support staff who will be overworked. I'll expect that there will be young physicians in OPD and other places who who are not just overworked, but who are unhappy because they don't know whether they're going to get into the super specializations because seats are limited and it is very expensive in some cases. Sometimes people might be scared to tell the surgeon, for example, that, sir, you have not followed the checklist and we are running a danger. Uh, I have these kind of visions in my mind, and what is the reality, and what have you done in Dr. Mehta's hospital in terms of people management and creating the right work culture?
So I think first, hospital is one of the most complex systems that you can ever find. I thought I had good learning and good experience, even with some of the consulting projects that I work with in McKinsey, quite diverse, from large financial institutions, large chemical companies, energy companies, as well as building nuclear enrichment plants. But trust me, running a hospital is much tougher. Very heterogeneous workforce, highly diverse consumer expectations depending on your service mix. So for us, we go all the way from birth to the complex surgeries, whether it's neuro, ortho, cardio, uro, gastro, they're all very complex. Two things that are around medical care for people in the late stage of life when they're just recovering from, say, illnesses, and pediatrics, which is similar. Sometimes it takes time to diagnose what the right thing is. So it's complex and it's not simplistic. I think you mentioned two things. The first is these are multidisciplinary teams. So to a large extent, that even though we have in some area of the extremes, we have doctors that are recognized as critical for success and safety, I would actually say that it's teams. A nurse spends in inpatient care treatment about 80% of the time with the consumer and their family. And the family is very important to the consumer because the speed of rehabilitation, the emotional state of the consumer, as well as the post-recovery, and then the future set of events, how much they behave themselves with the post-hospital care, is all a function of a combination of individual willpower and the support system of a family. So the consumer is not just an individual, it is at the end of the day also a family. I think, first of all, understanding that is being critical. Second, I think when you look at the fact that the nurse spends so much time with the customer, a technician is critical to the success and welfare of a customer most of the time behind the scenes. Just like here, you've got a number of people in GMI who are helping with this interview behind the scenes. The same exists in a hospital, but multiplied by factor fold, right? So for us to make sure that a consumer comes in, that we diagnose the right issue, that we've understood the right thing with the least amount of, for example, imaging or lab tests, right, is actually quite hard. Because if you look at the West, there's this rule of thumb that says for an average person, an inpatient, you have to have 9 lab tests. In India, we're under 5, right? So actually, that's one of the rare things in India, that making sure, how do you get superior clinical outcomes? Because people here expect the best of the world, right? With more constrained resources and constrained components that are going for us. We don't always have insurance companies that bless us with go and explore. We don't have a number of things that are typically available to institutions and ecosystems outside. So I think, how do you do that as a multidisciplinary team? How do you make sure that your team has the big picture, which is, at the end of the day, if you make the life of this person better, right? This could be your parent, your child, your spouse on the operating table, in the inpatient, in the outpatient. And if you keep them waiting for 30 minutes, whether you're a star surgeon, right, or you're a housekeeper that's just got too much to do at any moment in time, I think, first of all, bringing that home, that this could be you or one of yours. Second is, if you do it in a team, we get to celebrate a bit more in the team, and also you take the harshness and some of the tougher times, because at some times, unfortunately, people do transition and we're not able to make a difference. I mean, you take during COVID, we treated some 13,000 consumers with COVID at a serious setting. We're not talking about people who would recover at home. You're talking about people who needed a hospitalization, and a vast majority of them needed critical care. We lost 168 individuals, right? And if you actually do the math, you find out you're the top hospital in the country from a clinical outcomes point of view, right? This was, just to put context, this was less than 1.7% in terms of failure rate, and 98.3% success rate. It was 98.4 something in the end. But for every one of those families, the 168 families, we didn't succeed, right? They came to you. Most of them did not get the privileged way of saying goodbye to their, whether it was their parents or their siblings, or in some cases, their loved ones close. They did not get a chance to say, because during COVID, the rules changed dramatically. You were not there, right? You had to trust and entrust somebody to look after them. And for a large number of people, we weren't treating our loyal consumers, because we were helping anybody who came to our hospital or anybody who got referred to us, right? We tried our best to do it with others, but we also learned that if you're really there, you have to serve everybody you can, right? So we had a new hospital that had just been commissioned about 6 months in, also in Chennai. And keep in mind, a new hospital takes time to get up to speed. And we opened 100 beds that, honestly, were we fully ready? The answer was no. But we needed to, because society needed it, right? Because if we didn't do it, then these people did not have that chance. And we did it because we had a really strong, committed team. I think we were lucky because we had people still coming to the hospital and putting themselves at risk when they had high degrees of uncertainty, when their families were putting enormous pressure on them. And in the very early days, there weren't sufficient PPEs and the like. I think we did 3 simple things. And I'll actually share this, because I think this is, at the end of the day, when you group think and group solve and do good planning, things work out. I think the first thing we did is we said, irrespective of where you are, who you are, we'll give you the PPEs that we can, right? So, people used to get we used to hear in other hospitals, they used to quarantine the number of masks. We never tried that. We said, we trust you, use what you need to do, right? If you need stuff at home because it keeps your family safer, please take it, right? So first, look after your team. And one of the smartest thing we did was we kept 10 beds aside for all the team members of our doctors, our nurses and hospitals, because that earned the trust of the family to send those loved ones at risk. The second thing we did was we borrowed a lot of wisdom from other friends of ours, CMC Vellore, Medanta, Manipal Group, Apollo, many of the other guys, the army, armed forces, the government, because what people don't realize is the government actually took the brunt of the front outpatient early wave, right? Yes, a lot of the private hospitals strengthen their brand, but actually you give a lot of credit to the government because they did it without a playbook that was like nothing in the world had ever seen before, including themselves. And we borrowed this wisdom and we leveraged technology heavily. So one of the smartest techs was having this alert app that remotely monitored all the monitors in all our ICUs and gave the data on the mobile phones of each of our nurses, doctors, and technicians. And one learning we had is not just give it to the doctors, but give it to the technicians, the nurses, and sometimes the family members as well. So the family member at home would get a daily report, irrespective of whether the doctor calls them, which tells them how they're doing. And it went from a daily report to twice a day. And that meant that the anxiety level was not allowed to build beyond the point. One. I think second is because we gave this app to the nurses self-created early warnings, and they asked for an alarm system on the app to say that, look, when SpO2 for this patient drops below a certain number, so 96, give me an alert. And they would have different ones for each different customer in the ICU, but a duty doctor would have a slightly higher alert. A head of department would have a higher alert. And what that led is that allowed escalation. And one of the best things I've seen in our hospital is today in Dr. Mehta's, in any of our units, we don't have a graveyard shift. We don't have a time at Sunday night at 3 a.m. where you've got typically a doctor that is willing to work in an ICU, but doesn't have the same level of qualifications and perhaps sometimes focus as somebody at the peak of Monday morning, 10 o'clock. Because you had this team that compensated for an individual all of a sudden. And you had technology that gave you peace of mind. I think those were two things. And the third was around supply chain. So look, in the peak of COVID, one of the things we faced was a shortage of a lot of the critical medicine that was life critical because everyone needed it. And there was a shortage, either distribution challenge or global supply demand challenge. And what we did is we went to our suppliers and before the multi-waves of COVID, and we said, here is prepayment for what we think we may need. And we picked 20 suppliers and we prepaid them a little bit more than the bills we owed them. So normally in a hospital environment, you have 90 days of credit. And what we did is we reduced that to 0 for some of our suppliers, and we gave them a bit of money in the system. And they are our best friends today, right? Because we were there by their side in their toughest time. Because if we had a tough time, they must have had a really awful time. I think it's simple things like that. If you put yourself in the shoes of whether it's the customer, whether it's somebody on your team that's going through a tough time, whether it's the surgeon, I think we're able to relate so that we don't have these prima donna type attributes that show up. And actually in Dr. Mehta's, I'll actually say we treat people as members of the family. And if there are misbehaving members of the family, we do sit down and talk with them. And we like to be transparent because at the end of the day, and I've had a number of tough conversations with some of the most senior surgeons and clinicians. And sometimes we say, thank you, no thank you, especially around ethics and behavior. There are certain things we don't put up. But when we say no to 2 or 3 people, the remaining 1,000 see that. And the 1,000 will tell the next 10,000 friends of theirs that actually Dr. Mehta's is a good place to be. And if you actually ask me what is the secret, we're the oldest surviving private hospital in India today, is what we've been told by the press. Because, and I look at that sadly because we've lost a lot of great neighbors. We've had a lot of great peers that taught us good things. We had a lot of people around us that made life a little bit easier at the peaks and troughs of major disasters. And we don't have some of that today. We have these corporatized groups that are very different in their behavior. They don't treat people as people. They treat them as statistics or as performance indicators. I think if you treat your consumer as you could be in their shoes, life is better. If you treat your doctor as somebody that you would like to share time with, life is just better, right? Because if you like to share time with good people, you grow the right type of family around you, and the family at the end of the day will look after each other. So hospitals, as I started off saying, very complex. We have in each of our hospitals over 1,000 people, right? And it's not that a surgeon is more important than the housekeeper, because the housekeeper who doesn't look after infection control is sometimes more critical than the surgeon. but you don't realize that until the consumer has left your hospital, right? Your security guard that smiles at a customer when they walk into the hospital and gives them a sense of confidence that this place may be able to help you is a choice of the security guard, right? And that's typically an outsourced member of the team, but you got to make them feel as a member of the family and team. So if you make that happen, I think life is simpler. If you're transparent in what you expect, so I think setting very clear expectations, I think that's a basic. You teach us that in most of the sessions you talk to us about. I think that helps, because when we have clear expectations, we kind of like know that there is a standard to which we have to achieve. And you shouldn't start a standard with something below where you are, right? Tomorrow has to be better than yesterday, because our customers come to us desiring a better tomorrow for themselves than their yesterday, right? Especially in a healthcare setting. So I think that's the attitude and the perspectives we have at least learned through our time.
I'm going to summarize what you have said, and then I'm going to pose a very, what I think is a tough question, but somebody who has worked with McKinsey and the kind of experience that you have with startups, you'll be able to probably have your take, which is the model of healthcare promoted by private equity and others for whom the return on investment is the biggest driver for in this industry. But before that, you said a few things which are very interesting to me. You kept on repeating the word consumer. You are not using the word patient. You are rarely using the word customer, and you have used the word consumer, and that tells me that there is some difference in the way you look at the patient. You also talked about the big picture and the fact that there are two types of organization, the purpose maximization organization or the profit maximization. Now, it doesn't mean that because you have a purpose, you don't have profits, but what is your focus? And you talked about five or four or five principles that you trust your people and don't ration essential things like PPE when they need it. You set aside maybe 10 beds for your people and their families so that they know that in the worst case scenario, they will be taken care of. There are many people in Mumbai Municipal Corporation who lost their lives. And I happened to go to some of their sites and I was simply amazed by the work that government workers who are not ready, who have not been trained, are doing in the middle of COVID. But how do you tell them that, we are with you? If something happens to you, we are with your families. You talked about amazing use of technology and app to really make things easier, the supply chain, and also integrating your suppliers and then you say that at the end of this there are clear expectations to for these people. I'm just reminded of an incident that some of my friends in Fortune magazine in US was narrating when they went to interview the CEO of Mayo Clinic. And that interview was, according to them, not the most interesting interview. And they were looking for a headline. And as they were coming out, they found a janitor who was disinfecting, the toilets and other areas. And they asked her, this is a lady, she said, "What do you do?" And she says, "I save lives." And they were zapped and they said, "How do you save lives?" And she said exactly what you said in the beginning of this interview. She said, "A lot of patients may lose their life because of secondary infection. My job is to make sure that it is minimized." And that became the headline, as opposed to the CEO's interview, because when the janitor understands the importance of saving lives and how his or her role is connected to that, then you are creating a mission-centric organization. So if you were to summarize everything that you have told me, and then also give me your opinion on how this industry is going, and is private equity, VC funding, all of that really helping uh, solve real problems in this country, or are we losing focus somewhere? So I'll distinguish it in two parts. First, For 90 years, if you have existed where nobody else has existed for such a long time, from pre-independence, you have created a very strong purpose-focused culture that is not dependent on one or two CEOs or founders. So if you were to look at that, you have already given us quite a few elements of that culture, but would you like to summarize it for our viewers in just two or three very important things that set aside your culture from maybe many other organizations that you may know of?
So I think culturally, the first one is if you put yourself in the consumer's shoes and solve, the world is easy. Tomorrow has to be better than yesterday, which means that you're always on a quality-oriented journey, and therefore you can't rest on laurels of success. So when you help a customer, make sure you then give them the tools to the family as well as the consumer individually, that they don't come back that often, so that they trust you, that you are in good hands the next time. I think that matters. That builds trust across a generation. People don't like hospitals unless you're just born in them and you keep coming for births. People typically don't like hospitals. I think the third is, I think I've said it, I must have said it. You treat people like members of the family. And if you treat people like members of the family when they need you, it matters. Because I think those are the simple components. When we're all human beings, we will all bleed exactly the same way, right? Yes, our type of blood is a little bit different, and some people will have rare blood. Rare blood, by the way, is unfortunate, not fortunate, because finding a blood match, if you've ever had need for it, is not easy. So I think treat people like we'd like to be treated. Be tough on misbehavior, I think is something. We are a performance-centric organization. You can't survive till 90 without taking performance relative. And for us, performance is, you've got to be able to look at the decision and process rather than sometimes the outcome by itself. Because sometimes good process and strong decisions still may lead to poor outcomes. But if you can figure that out and therefore do root cause analysis, and we do on average about 3 to 5 root cause analysis every week in a hospital. And then we talk about it with groups and we try and make sense of it and we try and share that learning with others, right? I think learn from everyone. We also learn from our consumer. Let's be honest, the expert on a person's health is themselves, right? So I think this challenge sometimes with technology that a doctor spends too much time looking and talking to a computer is real. A doctor should actually spend more time talking and listening to the consumer, because the consumer knows what's wrong with them, may not know it from a clinical setting context, may know symptoms rather than root cause. But if you don't listen to that symptom, you don't understand really rare root causes. I think that matters. So listening is critical. So that's what we do. We listen to our peers, we listen to the market and indicators. Sometimes, and we have some great peers, right? CMC, Vellore, Arvind Eye Hospital are awesome institutions, right? That we can learn a lot from and still have a lot of learning from. So every month we take a leadership team with a few more enthusiastic people to go and have an experience in somebody else's ecosystem, not always in healthcare, sometimes in hospitality, sometimes we do that we took people to IIT to go and see how people do new product development and design space rockets, right? I think by doing things like that, their world is bigger, richer. So that, I think that's what Dr. Mehta's is, right? We have to be up to date as a clinical team. We have to treat ourselves like a team and make sure we're the sum of strengths rather than the sum of parts, right? If you're the sum of parts, you sometimes get negatives. Sum of strengths, you always get positives. I think that's something that we focus on heavily. Answering your second question is actually not easy. I think the right proxy to think of is most of India today is rural India. If you look at most of this venture cap, not so much venture is early stage, but private equity, which is typically later stage, proven business models, which is what hospitals really are. I think most of that money is flowing to players to do another hospital in a major city. How do I have another hospital in Chennai, in Bombay, in Bangalore, in Delhi, the 5 major cities, right? It's
Got
not
it.
going to something else because they all want the brand next door, because they think the next investor, the retail investor, is going to look at that and bang for the buck is here. So I'm not sold on private equity in hospitals, right? I know there are some successful guys. Apollo is a great example. Medanta, there's some very good examples, HCG. But over long cycles, I'm talking about 100-year cycles, I am absolutely certain, 100% certain. And history has shown this, that almost no private equity funded company lasts time, right? And a hospital is a system you want to last time. It is not something that's early stage. It has life cycle of a corporation and then it can fade off into the sunset, like the guys who designed in the early days a digital camera, or let's say a paper printing thing as the world is digitizing. I think a hospital, it will change in its behavior because it will doctors will still be there, but they'll have a lot of technology assistance. They'll have robots to help them. They'll have maybe a lot of machine algorithms to help you with imaging as well as diagnosis. So the prediction part of the thing and helping people keep superior health post-surgery or post-hospitalization. But you'll still need interventions. You'll still need these events. And I'm not sure that private equity is the best proven source of capital, where there is a cost to that capital in terms of outcomes that are needed on a quarterly basis or an annual basis, that has a life cycle of a financial product of most PE funds are 7 years, right? I'm not sure that that method, and I advise funds, I invest in some of them, right, is the right sourcing ingredient for hospitals. And that's the reason we haven't taken any, right? We want to do the right thing for a customer, irrespective who the customer is, because of what the customer has, not because what our shareholder wants, right? And I think that is different. And I think we've learned this from some of the others. Let's be honest. It's I could be proven wrong, but if you look at the top corporations over 100 years, I don't think data shows that external funding stress is another stressor on a system. And when you have a co-owner that cycles out every 7 to 10 years, it means that your transitions become like a relay race, more complex than sometimes long-term ownership, like family businesses have proven.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is interesting. I am the founder of another organization called Great Place to Work, and a majority of the 100 best workplaces globally and in US for sure, who have been there for decades, are family owned businesses. So whether it is the SC Johnson family or it is Bill Marriott of Marriott, and there are so many examples. And I think the simple definition that I give is that if your mission is something that you will not be able to fulfill in your lifetime, how would a private equity guy come and hope to do that better? At least that model is not very clear to me. If you have something which you want to achieve in the next 10 years and complete it, then I think it might make sense, more sense. Having said that, there are all kinds of models, so we'll park it for the time being. The last 5 minutes, I want to talk about what is your sort of secret sauce or recipe now as a people manager. Do you have, you talked about building on strengths of your people. Do you have any kind of way in which you approach people? And give us a few tips so that those who are aspiring to be great people managers, they can probably take home one or two things that they can do, uh, straight from today onwards.
I think, look, for us, if tomorrow is better than yesterday for you as a manager, you have to find certain routine activities and make them simpler, more efficient, more effective. So I think one thing we like looking is borrow wisdom as much as possible, because it's much cheaper than earning it oneself. You lose your hair, and I've lost a fair bit on that. So borrow wisdom from where you can. and not always in the most obvious places. As I said, we go with our teams to go and see sometimes not hospitals, because we might learn something better, whether it's a different way of keeping in touch with the customer, whether it's a different way of making our clinicians' life a bit simpler, whether it's a different way of planning. We learn from, for example, ISRO and NASA on how to look at quality in emergency care settings, right? So how do you multi-skill team members so triage is faster? So most hospitals have a triage of around 3 minutes when you come into your scene. In our hospitals, it's 30 seconds,
Wow.
right? And how do you do that? We learned that from how ISRO did it and how NASA did it. But actually, the inspiration came from somebody who was looking at Formula One. If you can change the tires and do the fuel, you can sure as heck do that, at least the triage, to understand how serious a customer is, like that. I think that's one. I think the second thing we do, which is useful, is, we talked about our strengths. So we worked with our teams and we started designing these games. And we have these card games today that we use in a number of different settings. We have a game for values, because we used to keep hearing that in Dr. Mehta's, your values are very strong. So we needed a way to understand how do we, A, communicate our values, but more importantly, how do we make sure that these 1,000 people in each hospital have a set of aligned values, and even if they're different values, they're still respectful of each other's values, right? Because the issue is everyone's going to have different values. What you think is most important is likely to be a little bit different to what somebody else. I mean, my wife finds certain things important which are different to mine, and as long as you're respectful of that, you're able to work well together, right? If you understand each other's set of values, your energy source, right? So I'll give you an example. I'm intellectually very curious. So my energy source is I get a lot of energy through mental and emotional activities. I'm extrovert. My wife is introvert. She's extremely smart, much smarter than me. And Rochna gets most of her energy through physical and emotional, right? But she does not get much through mental activities. And she started now to get a lot through spiritual activities. My parents get most of their source of things through spiritual and emotional. And by the way, it's changed. My parents used to get most from mental activities, right? So when we understand that energy driver of the people who we sit across the table from, we're able to give them opportunities that are aligned to that. So when sometimes we get tickets, customer may come, you save the life of somebody important, they give you tickets to like the movie awards every year. I know which doctor or nurse or member of the housekeeping team to go give that tickets to. We get these tennis tickets. We know that some people like sports, they may not be able to afford it. We can afford it. We just don't have time to enjoy it as much. So making sure we get that alignment of things so that people benefit from what their natural tendency is, whether their strength, their value system, their energy. So putting the right people in the right places, I think helps. So an example is we have a chief belief officer in Dr. Mehta's. It's not a very common role. We haven't heard too many chief belief officers. And what our chief belief officer does is their key role is to go and allow people to express themselves and to believe in what they do, right? So they regularly organize sit-down sessions that are like mini lectures, but with a lot of interaction in them. But they also sit down with one-to-ones, and they try and catch people at times that are tough and try and reaffirm, why did you come and share time with the mission that we're aligned to? And is there something that's changed? And sometimes the right answer for an individual is to say, something, you need a break, go take a break. Or sometimes for an individual, it's, look, your family priorities mean that you should perhaps look at something slightly different with less stress. You're not able to make things make sense at home because you're not spending time with your children. Your children are going through a very critical period. This is how some of our others have managed to go through this. But how do we have that conversation in a safe way? We use these cards as a conversation starter and something that, because the concept of games is you reduce your emotional stress, right? You're giving more emotional and motivational allowance to the people around you. That's the term I've learned since I've gotten involved in gamification. And I think when people are themselves, but they share their most vulnerable moments to each other in safe settings. There's a term psychological safety that's quite popular today. Uh, I think that's part of the answer, that organizations will flourish better because you can have those conversations with a surgeon that's coming close to, for example, a lot of internal stress, but it hasn't shown up in their clinical outcomes. So you can catch it before it really is an issue. You can catch the fact that a nurse is getting a lot of pressure at home, so you can ease off the pedal, let them take some time off, so they come back rejuvenated. You can figure that out with a technician that's seeing the same thing again and again, and they're getting a little bit tired of the task. If they're getting tired, they're going to make a mistake, right? So because they're not checking as much, they think they've taken it for granted. So how do you catch those little things? I think that is by being very conscious of the people you're around. And you can't do that as one leader or one manager or one person in a team when there are 999 other people that sit across your days gone overnight in seconds, right? Or in moments. So I think what we've realized is that you have to empower these different people, the champions across the organization, to do chief belief officer, to do chief values officer, to do chief fun officer, right? We actually have fun sometimes, not as much. We wish we had more, right? We invited these medical clowns every year to come and do something a little bit innovative and novel in our hospital to make the lives of our customers around Christmas and Pongal and Diwali a little bit different, because when these medical clowns come in, they try and make children smile. And if a child is suffering from cancer, that's a really tough smile. That's a hard-earned smile.
It is.
And if you return these lost smiles, isn't that what we do?
Here is what, Samir, I would propose to you as we end this conversation is you have actually deciphered human relationships, and you have created a few very simple ways in which uh, you can create a culture of continuous improvement. You can uh, align people's values with the culture that you want to create. You can understand the energy of the other person from where it is coming, and it seems to me that it's not all that very complicated. There are not 200 different ways in which people get energy, and you have uh, been able to create a psychological an environment of psychological safety. Imagine a surgeon who has just lost a patient, and for him, but he can't lose his confidence, and therefore, for him to be vulnerable uh, and yet go back to the next surgery with confidence, it is it's a very very difficult job, and I would invite you to do actually probably something like a workshop. If it's not you, maybe one of your colleagues who could do a workshop with some of the CXOs that we have who are very keen to to implement some of these things that you have spoken about. And we also have a book that we publish every year, which is all about the best practices of the best people managers. So we'll go back to you to capture in more detail. I must say, a million babies, and our goal is a million managers. That is our next goal, immediate goal, and you have already produced a million babies. So you have delivered a million babies. So you are such an inspiration for us, and thank you so much for your time today.